let me introduce Dr. Carrie Alexander. Carrie is also a member of our Secure Food Systems team at the University of Minnesota, also a very experienced risk analyst. She got her undergrad degree from UC Berkeley, her DVM from Colorado State, and her master's degree of public health from the University of Minnesota. She's held secure food supply coordinator jobs at the Minnesota Department of Ag and as a public health and public preventive medicine resident at the University of Minnesota. She's been with our team for a number of years, most recently as a risk analyst, and she is presenting something that she worked on very closely with Mickey Leonard, another member of our team. And you are all mic'd up, and the controller's here. And we got that, and then forward and back. Back. There you go. Take it away.
Thank you. So I'm not Mickey Leonard. I apologize. She was not able to be here today, so I hope this goes okay. So I'm talking about a different project that we're working on also in the pork industry. It has to do with harvest facility pathways and mitigations for African swine fever. So if African swine fever were to enter the U.S., the pork industry would have disruptions in every aspect of production, obviously. So to protect the industry and the supply of pork products, the industry needs to be prepared at every step along the pig life cycle. And analysis of the plant flow for pork processing facilities is an important part of the Secure Food Systems team work in planning for an African swine fever outbreak. For our pathway analysis, we set out to consider both the inputs and the outputs of harvest facilities to allow for the full cycle of potential virus entry into and exit from the processing plant. So the objectives were, first of all, to determine the inputs and outputs of the pork harvest facilities. So in other words, pathways of ASF virus introduction and spread. And I should say these are still our objectives because the project is still in process. To define the pathways and then categorize them by mitigation level in terms of virus mitigation. And then with the input from the industry, assign priorities for further risk assessment based on the perceived risk of each of those pathways. So in order to be sure that we captured all of the major inputs and outputs for pork processing, we collaborated with two Midwestern pork harvest facilities. One is an integrated producer-owned system, and the other gets its pigs off of the open market. So we felt that they would well represent industry standards. And also, since the harvest facilities that are within the scope of our project are federally regulated, there's little room for variation between the companies for their practices. So our work with the collaborators involved meetings with company representatives to discuss the different plant flow and the different processes. And we also did an in-person tour of a pork harvest facility. And in addition to working with collaborators, we searched the literature for regulations as well as practices within the pork processing industry, and that included FSIS regulations under the USDA Code of Federal Regulations. So in the end, I know you can't read this, it's really tiny, but I just wanted to show you what we ended up with. So the inputs are on the left, and the open arrows indicate vehicles would be involved in that. And then around the rest of the rectangle are the outputs, and from raw products to leather to rendered products, wastewater, things like that. So I apologize for the small font, but I just wanted you to be able to see kind of the big flow that we came up with for harvest facilities. So the work with our collaborators and the literature searches resulted in the following 6 inputs for 6 input pathways, and that would, so in other words, the pathways by which African virus could be introduced into the facility. And after the pathways were determined, we did an additional literature search to determine if there were already any virus mitigating regulations or steps in the process in place. So the pathways in green were determined to be fully mitigated. The pathways in orange are somewhat mitigated. Actually, it's more brown. And then the pathways in red are unmitigated. And as you'll see in the next slide, there will be pathways in blue, and that indicates that they are unknown or we didn't have enough information to determine whether or not they would be mitigated. So the combination of the mitigation status and the potential for African swine fever virus introduction, helped us create a priority ranking for the risk assessments that are of highest need. And the input and output pathways, and you'll see the output ones in a bit, that are bolded are the ones that we assume to be the highest priority for further risk assessments, but we will be discussing this with our collaborators. So just to explain a little further, the pathways that are considered fully mitigated have mitigations that support the inactivation and or exclusion of the virus. For example, pests in water have enough regulation to consider these pathways as mitigated. Harvest facilities are required to have pest management programs in place to prevent pests and breeding of pests on the premises. And also through discussion with our collaborators, we determined that most harvest facilities, or the majority or all, use municipal water sources, so treated water. And again, this is for input. And this is also supported by the Code of Federal Regulations, which provides additional details about the requirements for clean water for use within the harvest facilities. So the pathways that we considered somewhat mitigated either have a mixture of mitigated and unmitigated components, or their mitigations may not entirely support the inactivation or exclusion of the virus. The people pathway, for example, has some federal regulations that dictate personal hygiene and hygiene while working at the plant, but there's a lack of restriction in general regarding contact with other pigs. And our work with the collaborators showed that most harvest facilities likely do not have requirements such as mandatory downtime after contact with outside pigs. The unmitigated pathways have no standard mitigations and are, as a result, they're areas of risk for virus introduction into the harvest facility. When pigs go to the plant for processing, sick pigs may not be truly segregated from the rest of the pigs before they're euthanized and sent to rendering. In addition, there are few regulations for pig holding, aside from being to ensure that the bedding is clean at a frequency, high enough frequency to keep the pigs clean. So the bedding may be used between loads with little maintenance in between. And this lack of mitigation shows a gap in biosecurity where the virus could spread within the plant if an infected but undetected pig is brought into the plant. And then vehicles are another unmitigated pathway. Employees, visitors, and FSIS inspection program personnel all use the same parking lot. And there are no restrictions for vehicles, so they may come from different locations that house live pigs. Also, the FSIS personnel may visit multiple plants without any vehicle cleaning and disinfection in between. And live haul vehicles do not have requirements for undercarriage or tire cleaning prior to or at the time of arrival at the facility. So these vehicles may have come from different locations with live pigs and may continue to go on to additional locations where there are also live pigs. So with a process similar to that for the inputs, we discovered 15 main output pathways. And these pathways obviously represent ways that the virus could be spread from the plant if an undetected ASF infected pig were processed. So output pathways have more uncertainty as many product processes are facility specific, so we weren't able to generalize as much. The processes for products such as ready-to-eat products tend to be proprietary. Thus, we're unable at this time to determine what, if any, mitigations are in place for those outputs. So that's an area where more work would be needed. Live haul vehicles, people and waste in the form of manure and garbage are the pathways where we perceive there to be the highest risk for the spread of the virus from the plants. These pathways are largely unmitigated, which makes the potential for spread quite high. And as with the incoming vehicles, the live haul vehicles do not have cleaning and disinfection requirements when they leave the processing plants, since plants don't typically have truck washes on site. And then the loading docks are not usually clean between loads of pigs, which creates a potential for cross-contamination of the trucks. And again, these vehicles may go on to other locations with live pigs. The employees from the different sections of the plant are also not entirely segregated. So, for example, lairage and kill floor employees and cut floor employees may share break and or locker rooms, and they all leave the plant floor from the same general area. Management is also not entirely segregated from the floor employees. And the FSIS inspectors may go from plant to plant with no known mitigation between those visits. For example, shower or change of clothes on entering the plant operations, although they do have required change of clothing before performing and after completing antemortem inspections. Finally, manure and live haul bedding typically go to a landfill, and there are few to no mitigations in place for those leaving the harvest facilities. And the same goes for garbage. And there obviously may be virus in the manure or the bedding or even in the garbage that's then being transported to landfills. So one thing to mention here, the live resale pigs, although they are a high risk of spreading the virus from the plant, in all likelihood that movement would be stopped in an African swine fever outbreak because of the high risk and the difficulty in obtaining a permit to move those pigs off-site. So it would actually be more expeditious and economical for the plants to render those pigs. Let's see. And then companies themselves will need to determine where they need to apply additional mitigations or possibly stop shipping certain products off-site if they are unsure about whether or not the virus could spread. A lot of that depends on their individual processes for how they process certain products at the plant. And the rendering process has been shown to inactivate the African swine fever virus due to the time and temperature combination of the process. And also there is little likelihood of cross-contamination between incoming products for rendering and then outgoing rendered products. Okay. So to sum it up, only 6 of 22 pathways we only determined 6 of 22 pathways to be fully mitigated and to have a low perceived risk of introducing or spreading the virus from the harvest facility. The other 16 pathways still have gaps and present risk, and that's about 73% of the pathways. Again, these are preliminary results. We're still working with the companies and gathering more information on these pathways. But one thing is that these gaps do point out areas for the plants where they can hone in and focus on enhanced biosecurity or different processes for their products. Okay. So as I I mentioned, we're continuing to work with our industry collaborators in finalizing the risk assessment priorities. But presumably, we will be focusing on these pathways for further risk assessment. And we hope to have additional projects where we really dive into these different pathways. And also expand our collaboration to other industry partners, so we're sure that we're representing the majority of the industry. So I want to, this is our team. I want to thank our team. This is definitely a team effort. And Mickey is the one circled there. So unfortunately, she put a lot of effort into this presentation, was not able to be here. So are there any questions?
First thing, Carrie, before we open up the floor for questions.
Nice presentation. I got a question on the incoming pigs. Have you considered subdividing that population? It seems to me there's two sets. You got the sets that come directly off the farm that have no time to incubate infection, but that reshipped pigs, they also end up back at another packing plant. There's also pigs that are aggregated at aggregation points and brought into the farm. Some of those pigs have adequate time to incubate infection in the market chain, and to me, they're a much higher risk input into a plant than the pigs coming directly off the farm, just because of their time in the infected chain. Have you given any thought to that as a separate input?
Yeah, I mean, I think as we go further into this, it would be nice to be able to break it down into those different components of the system. And one thing to keep in mind is that the assumption is that these pigs are infected but undetected, so they're early in the course of disease. So our assumption is that they are incubating the virus, the ones that we consider to be the risk here. So, yeah. But yeah, the more we can get into the details of each path, the better, definitely.
Just to clarify, the current question, I'm just back to my memory from when I was working in this region. Is it true that pigs sometimes come into a slaughter plant holding facility and can leave as live pigs to go to another facility?
Yeah.
So would that be considered an output?
Right, yeah. And I
Okay.
thought that should be how it was. Yeah.
Resale pigs, okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I had to step out for a minute, so
Oh, no, that's fine.
maybe
There
missed
they
it.
are. Yeah, on the top right. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
We've heard like food products, and it'll show up in wild boars, and you think about if a hunter's carrying a contaminated food product and eats a half a sandwich, the boar will find it as a potential risk. But you cook them. I mean, I have a little struggle with that. You cook the meat, and so it has to be like contaminated after it's cooked. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's, I think one of those would be, for example, the ready-to-eat products. That was one area where we weren't able to determine whether the virus would be eliminated in that process, because those processes tend to be proprietary, so that we can't get that specific information from the processing plant. So what we proposed is that we provide them with the time and temperature needed and other parameters needed to inactivate the virus, and then they could themselves determine whether their processes eliminate the virus. We can only do so much with the information that we're able to get, and then the responsibility is on the processing plant to make sure that what they're sending out wouldn't be spreading virus. But that's a good question, but it is an unknown at this point.
But I think as a point of qualification on ready-to-eat is that, there are cured products, right, that are not fully cooked. And there's been a lot of work done, I think, on survival in those as well. But obviously, those might be something that's ready to eat but not cooked.
Exactly, yeah.
Plant staff unloading the trailers. So plant staff go into the trailers, move the animals off. Would you see that process ending? Would it increase to keep the driver out of the plant? And we can assume that trailer is going to have to be sanitized in some way when it leaves the plant, regardless of any potential cross-contamination.
So your question, what is your question? I'm sorry.
So my question is, more and more packing plants are unloading the trailers and
Yeah.
removing the driver from that process. Now, obviously, that's going to increase potential crossover. Do you think that practice will end, or will we increase it? To keep the driver out of the packing plant, reduce crossover with that driver, and we can assume that that trailer is going to have to be sanitized when it leaves the plant anyway.
Yeah, so the driver helping with unloading should...
The driver does not unload, the
Right.
plant employees unload.
Right, yeah, yeah. So, I'm not sure I'm getting...
That's something that we've
Yeah.
been working at with just the 2 plants that we visited and we discussed.
Mhm.
There are opportunities for that type of change to occur. And that's where the area, I think Carrie pointed out pretty well, that's the area, right old red, light haul vehicles, that's the area where the risk assessment needs to occur.
Right. So when you're looking at a slaughter plant, the reason we did a pathway analysis rather than a risk assessment of slaughter plants is that we had to determine these things. Do the drivers get out of the truck and unload pigs, or do they stay in the cab or not? And because we've had the kind of all or nothing thing is if a slaughter plant receives an infected pig, everything coming out is infected. Right? And that's not necessarily true at all. In fact, there are mitigations in place, such as the rendered products and the casings and the plasma that inactivate the virus. And so we do have to then say, okay, let's stop, let's refocus on where could the contamination occur. And that's one of the things. And working with our poultry risk assessments, that truck and driver biosecurity is really key, right? The trailer could get disinfected, should be washed and disinfected, and the truck and driver just has to stay in the truck. And to quote Paul Yeski, the driver just has to stay in the GD truck. And that's a quote from him. I would never say anything like that. And that's the other thing, too, is we have these, maybe the 2 extremes of plants, a company-owned plant, fully integrated, and an open market plant, and then take that to the North American Meat Institute or other gatherings of harvest facility personnel and say, okay, where can we start moving forward all together as an industry?
Just a comment, I was curious to know if you, in the plants that you visited, differentiated that there are a certain percentage of plants with rendering facilities attached and rendering facilities that are off-site, right? So that in some, I think many harvest facilities have attached, but there are rendering facilities that are not on site that can receive from harvest facilities, if I'm not
Right, and-
mistaken.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that, the ones that we worked with have on-site rendering. And you're right, having off-site rendering poses another risk. Yep. And we don't have the numbers on how many have each. We haven't gotten that far yet, but yeah, that's a good point.
Thanks so much, Carrie, again, and look for more on this work to come. This is a big area, but it's a really exciting area for us to be working on. So